In this chapter, we're going to begin to study metabolism. And metabolism is the sum total of all of the chemical reactions that take place in the human body. And it's the balance between those reactions that are building things up, or the anabolic processes, and those that are breaking things down, which are the catabolic processes. So when we think about this, we can think about examples like carbohydrates. Okay. Those are going to be broken down into glucose. And then the glucose is broken down into pyruvate. And then the pyruvate is going to be broken down or transformed into acetyl-CoA. And then the carbon portion of the acetyl-CoA is going to be broken down further using the Krebs cycle. And from this process of breaking down those carbohydrates, we are going to gain energy, or ATP, throughout this. The process also we have water that's given off. We require oxygen. CO2 is part of this process. But there's a larger breakdown of carbohydrates, ultimately trying to get to CO2. We can do a similar process with proteins, which would be broken down into the amino acids. The amino acids can enter the above process at the pyruvate step or at the acetyl-CoA step. So we can enter in one of these two steps. And with this process, an amine is given off in the product and becomes a waste product in urine. And then we also have fats we talked about as another large category. And fats, or trace glycerols, are going to be broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And these are the products of the digestion of fats. And then the fatty acids are going to go into the above at the acetyl-CoA step. But then if we're thinking, and all of these are catabolic processes because we're breaking down. But we can also think about the building up processes and the carbohydrates. They can be stored as glycogen, which is stored energy. Our proteins, these are going to be used to build muscle and lean tissue. And then our fats, they can be stored as adipose tissue. And as we move through chapter 15, we are going to look at metabolism and the many coupled and interconnected reactions that occur. ATP and how it's the universal currency of free energy in biological systems. Oxidation of carbon fuels and how that leads to cellular energy. And then the recurring motifs that we see in metabolic pathways and how we regulate metabolic pathways. So here our focus is this top portion, this metabolism portion, and we're going to look at the basic principles of metabolism and just start to look at some of the interconnected reactions that we have. So metabolism can be described using 5 basic principles, and those are outlined here. The first is that molecules are degraded or synthesized in a series of reactions termed metabolic pathways. The second, ATP is the energy currency of life. The third, ATP can be formed by the oxidation of carbon fuels. 4, although many reactions occur inside a cell, there's a limited number of reaction types involving particular intermediates that are common to the metabolic pathway. So we can group these. And 5, metabolic pathways are highly regulated. So metabolism looks like a large and complicated process, But the number of different types of reactions and the mechanisms involved are actually simple. And the regulation of these reactions is done through common means. And it's actually very similar to how we've looked at regulation of, for example, enzymes. So here we're going to introduce the general principles, which include the information listed here. So why do living organisms require energy input? There are three major purposes: perform mechanical work, active transport of molecules and ions, and synthesis of biological molecules and macromolecules. Now, the energy for organisms, if the organism is a phototroph, the energy comes from trapping sunlight. And if it's a chemotroph, this energy comes from oxidation of food. And that food was ultimately generated by phototrophs. So we start to see even at this level the interconnection between these. So metabolism, again, we said that there were two broad categories of metabolism: those that convert energy from fuels into biologically useful forms, and those that require input of energy to proceed. So we have catabolic and anabolic pathways that come about from this. And we said that the catabolic processes are breaking down. So you have your fuels, which are broken down into CO2, water, and energy, useful energy. And in our anabolic processes, you have your energy, you have to input energy here, and some precursors, which are usually very simple precursors, and you take these together and you form complex molecules. There are some pathways that are anabolic, some that are catabolic, and some pathways can be either anabolic or catabolic, just depending on the conditions. If a pathway can serve as both an anabolic and a catabolic process, then we say that that is amphibolic. Now, looking at glucose metabolism as an example, and in future chapters, we'll look at how we go from glucose to pyruvate and pyruvate to lactate or acetyl-CoA. But this is the overall process. Now, ultimately, we want to take the fuel that we bring in, get it to glucose or some other intermediate, and take that and ultimately get it to acetyl-CoA, which can go into the Krebs cycle. So we're setting up the discussion for how we take this along. Now, the metabolic pathway in general, metabolism, there are so many reactions that take place, and they're all interconnected to one another. And the metabolic processes are all kind of shown here in this diagram. So this figure illustrates the variety of different reactions and processes that occur. Each little node there is going to represent a particular metabolite. So everywhere you see one of these little dots, that's a particular metabolite. It looks complex overall, but we can actually simplify this information in terms of the types of reactions that take place. Now, the reactions that occur in metabolism, we often will couple. So there are two criteria that must be met to construct a metabolic pathway. The individual reactions must be specific, and the pathway in total must be thermodynamically favorable. Now, we know that there are reactions that are unfavorable, and so the way we get around that is we couple an unfavorable reaction to a favorable reaction. So we have a combination of these. So as long as the sum of the reactions are going to be favorable, then we can get it to occur. So we'll take a look at coupling in just a second, but typically we couple these reactions to hydrolysis of ATP. And so here's the structure of ATP, ADP, and AMP. So the adenosine triphosphate, diphosphate, and monophosphate. And so we have these phosphate groups that we can break off in succession, and energy can be gained from these. But ATP is the general energy currency of the cell that we have. And we can see here that when you have ATP being hydrolyzed, it's an exergonic process or energy releasing process. So when we have one phosphate coming off, negative 30. If we have two that are removed, negative 45.6. Okay, so free energy is largely negative, and that's useful in allowing reactions that wouldn't normally take place. If we couple it to this, it will help it take place. Now there are other nucleoside triphosphates. So in addition to ATP, we can look at GTP or CTP, UTP, TTP. So they exist. And the hydrolysis of these other nucleoside triphosphates can also provide energy for reactions. Despite the fact that we can do this, though, and despite the fact that the energy is close to that of ATP, ATP is still going to be the primary energy carrier. Now, it's a phosphoryl transfer substance. We do have electron carriers that are involved in this overall process, and they are going to help contribute further down the road to making ATP. So here we're looking at this idea of coupling reactions, coupling unfavorable reactions to ATP hydrolysis. So here's a reaction converting A to B, and we see that the free energy is positive, which means this is not a favorable reaction. So if this is not a favorable reaction, the way that we can get it to go is to couple it to a reaction that is favorable. And so we see here that if we couple that conversion of A to B with the hydrolysis of ATP, we can get an overall process that is negative and as such is favorable. In general, cells maintain ATP levels by oxidizing substances or light as sources of free energy for ATP synthesis. Hydrolysis of ATP in a coupled reaction in the cell, it's going to change the equilibrium ratio, and so that allows the thermodynamically unfavorable reaction sequence to be converted into a favorable one. So it's very important that we're able to couple these things. So again, here we've looked at, in this brief segment of chapter 15, we've looked at metabolism and the different metabolic processes, and we have looked at the purposes for energy input. We've looked at the grand scheme of metabolism and why we couple reactions and the importance of coupling unfavorable reactions to the hydrolysis of ATP.